I'll first go ahead and introduce Dr. Tipsuda Chaomuangkhong before she gets started with her presentation. So, Dr. Tipsuda Chaomuangkhong received her PhD in Learning Literacies and Technologies from Arizona State University. She has over a decade of experience teaching English in K-12 in Thailand and in higher education in the US, and has also taught courses in supporting linguistically and culturally diverse learners. Her research focuses on immigrant families, family language policies, marginalized communities' life stories, and early childhood literacy and AI. She received the Teaching Excellency Award from Arizona State University in 2023. Congratulations. She will also, this is the good news, she will also join the Project United team this fall as a postdoctoral scholar. While going through Dr. Tipsuda's scholarly productions, I came across one of a very interesting article entitled Examining Self and Finding a Healing Path, Internalized Racism and Intersectionality of a Chai Marver Scholar, where she discusses the role of internalized racism and racial inequity that a Chai Marver scholar experiences while immigrating, settling, and giving birth in the US. So I found a very interesting and beautiful quote in this article that I want to share with you all before we start this session. And the quote says, she was talking about her baby. The quote says, watching her grow has been the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. She is capable and smart and makes me realize that all my success must have come from the unconditional love that my parents had for me. Although experiencing racism and discrimination can break our hearts, our spirits remain strong from the love we receive from family. So I would like us to get started on this good note from Dr. Tipsuda Chaomuangkhong, and I'll hand it over to her.
Oh, thank you so much, Barry. That was probably the best introduction I have ever got in a long, long time. And I'm so glad you got to read the article. Well, good morning, everybody. It is around 7 a.m. in Arizona. Is everyone in Iowa right now? Yes, thank you, Lindsay. I'll be joining all of you hopefully around September. So we'll get to see each other in person then. So today I will be presenting about my dissertation that I just defended on Tuesday. So hopefully I'm not too rusty to go over the topic. The title is Between Compliance and Resistance, Portraits of Former English Learners and Bilingual Pre-Service Teachers of Color in Structured English Immersion Teacher Training. Again, my name is Tipsuda Chaomuangkhong. I'm a postdoctoral scholar upcoming soon with Project United and receiving my PhD in learning literacies and technology from ASU. All right, so I did write a few questions for the audience today, and I would like to invite us to reflect on these questions together. The first one, and you can put hands up, you can do the reaction, or you can type your answer in the comment section, or just unmute yourself and share these with me, okay? If you feel comfortable. The first thing is, do we have anybody who speaks more than one language here? Cody is like, yes. Musa, can you speak more than one language?
Yeah, I speak 7 of those.
What? Okay, you win today. What are the 7 languages can you speak?
I speak English and French, and then I speak 5 other local languages.
Well, tell me about them. It's
Yeah,
important to name them as well, right?
yeah. So language, first of all, my mother tongue is Fulani. This is a language I grew up speaking within the family, and then there were like multiple languages spoken around the community. So I just picked up all of those 5 languages as a kid, so it was kind of pretty easy for me to learn. So we have Fulani, we have Jula, we have More, we have Dafin, we have Bobo. So I learned all of
That's
those languages
amazing.
within the community where I grew up.
Wow, thank you for sharing with me. Who else would like to share? Sarah said yes, so let's go with Sarah.
Not as interesting, but I speak Spanish as well.
What do you mean not as interesting?
I mean,
That
I
is
wish I knew that many
amazing.
languages.
I wish I knew Spanish and I don't know Spanish. I know Musa is a great example of like, because when we talk about bilingualism, right? Some people who can only speak one language may have a hard time understanding that you can master more than one language at the same time, right? And then Barry walks in the room and he's like, I can speak 7. That would blow their minds. Oh, thank you, everybody, for sharing with me. I see more answers in a comment. So that leads me to the next part, and I'm glad that we have multilingual audience here today. Before we dive into today's agenda, I want to start with a few questions, which I stated, knowing that now we have bilingual and multilingual audience with us. Just want to situate ourselves a little bit, okay, in the stories we're about to explore. I mean, this is about real people. And as you can see, Barry exists, he's right there. We do have multilingual people in our community. Now, have you ever felt shy or hesitant to use your home language in school, either as a student or as a teacher or in public places? Now, I'd like to invite somebody who hasn't spoken yet to answer that. I see the answer in the chat from Dual Brahim. I'm so sorry. Would you like to share with us?
Yeah, the message that I sent or type it on the chat box with the question if I speak more than one language.
Oh, yeah. And have you ever felt shy speaking them in public here in the US, like in school or when you go grocery shopping?
I didn't have a chance to do that because I didn't meet anybody who speaks it here.
Mm-hmm.
I all the time use my second language.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yep. And that's another problem, right? When we talk about multilingual community. For me personally, I always feel a little shy. I luckily made myself a speaking partner of all the languages that I speak. I speak Thai, I speak Lao. Lao comes out when I'm angry. That's the language my parents use with me. And so, when I go to public, I used to feel very self-conscious, but knowing the history of multilingualism, I understand it's, I need to really fight against that and really create space for us to speak. But definitely have felt shy and also have felt very hesitant to use those languages with my daughter. Now, maybe it was because, some people hesitate because we don't want to stand out, right, in public. Or maybe just somebody made a comment for you before that made you feel uncomfortable about using your language and made you feel like you don't belong in that space. For bilingual research teachers of color, the people that I'll introduce you to today through their life stories, this is not just a passing feeling, it's ongoing negotiation of identity, legitimacy, and belonging. Now, that leads me to the second question. For those of you who are in-service teachers or doing internship right now, okay, some teaching experience might help. Do you think your past experiences as a student, K-12 or higher education or both, your cultural background, your language, your community shape how you teach today, how you imagine your future classroom to be, or how do you plan to teach? If someone could volunteer to answer that question, that would help a lot. Oh, I see your answer, Emma. Thank you for sharing with me. No? Okay, we can reflect together. Now, the participants in my study reflected deeply on how identities, right, their racial, ethnic, linguistic identity, and also shape their experiences in the K-12. We'll learn more today, especially being labeled as English learners. And that really influenced the way they understand teaching, but not all of it. So yeah, with those questions in mind, I'm not going to go into the third one. Just want to get to the presentation today, but thank you so much for participating with me and answering those questions. So the agenda for today, I want to provide some context for the audience here. I will be going over the history of bilingual education, federal level, and also talking a little bit more about Arizona. I'll talk about a conceptual framework and methodology, and then I'll go into the portraits of the classes that I observe. Now, these are 3 different classes that train teachers on how to teach within the SEI model. SEI is structured English immersion. And so I observed those 3 classes and I wrote 3 different portraits of the class and also 1 student in each class. Okay, and then I'll end this with discussion and Q&A. I want to begin this presentation not with data or theory, but with a voice, a real voice. This quote comes from a former English learner in Arizona who recalled what it felt like to be pulled off mainstream instruction for hours every day, just to sit in a room and learn English through structured drills. Her words, "I would cry myself to sleep. I don't want to be here anymore." Now, I'm not sure how we interpret the last part, but either way, it is very heartbreaking. And unfortunately, these words are not rare in the state of Arizona. Now, we are aware of this, the recent change that on March 1st, 2025, Trump made English the official national language. This order marks more than just symbolic politics. It deepens the systemic push towards linguistic assimilation. While it doesn't ban multilingualism outright, it clearly favors English as the only legitimate civic language. Okay, so these are the white parts. These are the screenshots from the White House website that I took, and you can see how they frame English, right? That it would help if English is the official language. I mean, not if, but when. This is for unifying the American people. That's what he imagined. Strengthens the fabric of society, showcase the American culture, help immigrants achieve the American dream through using only English. And that can be problematic in so many ways, right? As we come from multilingual backgrounds, we can understand that. Now, English-only policies don't just emerge in isolation. They're rooted in the legacy of racialized schooling, where language was used not just to teach, but to sort, segregate, and silence students. To understand where we are today, we have to look back. Let's talk about how language has functioned historically and politically as a tool of segregation. Across the US history, especially in the Southwest, language has functioned as a tool of segregation. Now we can go back as late as far as the 1800s, right? If we remember, the indigenous children were taken from their homes, got cut hair, right? Sent to boarding schools far away from their family, really stripped of their identities. And then there came the rise of Mexican schools, where Mexican American children, many of them are US citizens, were sent to separate under-resourced classrooms. And I've read some work, right? We're talking about actual separate school, and they call it, that's for the Mexican people, and versus one school that looks better books, better facility. They call that's just for the white children, right? Where segregation was a little bit more obvious than today, though it still persists. And language has always become an excuse in a way, and used as a proxy for race to determine who belong in the mainstream spaces and who didn't, and really who deserve education. I want to pause here and ground this history in a real moment, a real case, because what happened in Westminster, California, help us understand what came later in places like Arizona. In 1946, 5 Mexican American families, including the Mendez family, challenged the fact that their children were being forced to attend segregated Mexican schools. One of those schools was Hoover School, pictured on the top right. was children, despite being used citizens themselves, were told that they needed to be separated from their white peers to improve English. But these students did speak English, and that's many cases for the participant in my story as well. They were born here in the US, they grew up speaking English, but just because they don't look white, you know, they just couldn't attend the regular class. Now, the court ruled in favor, and the Mendes v. Westminster became the first major federal school desegregation case in the US history. It was so significant that Marshall, who would later argue Brown v. Board, submitted a brief in support of Mendes' family. Okay, now here's another important case, especially in Arizona, okay? This case, Gonzalez v. Chile in 1951. This deserves equal, if not more, attention in Arizona's racial and linguistic history. In 1951, Mexican-American families in Polson, Arizona, sued the school district for placing their children. Now, this is another case where you can see it's the same school, but different units. Unit 1 is for white students. Unit 2 is for Mexican students, according to them, Mexican. And Unit 2 didn't even have curtain on the window, didn't have heating system, didn't have cooling. All the books were handed down from Unit 1. So it's definitely not equal, right? They were saying separate but equal, but it was never equal. And as Powers and Patton 2008 would document an article, many of the students placed in Unit 2 were already very proficient in English. So it wasn't even a legitimate excuse to segregate them there. And you can see this as more of a theme going on, how language gets used to segregate children of color from mainstream classes. I wrote a lot for my dissertation chapter 2 on policy, but this table would summarize that for you. All the important cases that I wrote, and also, you know, policy as well, not just the court cases. I'll touch on the next one. Lau v. Nichols, 1974, Chinese-speaking students in San Francisco argue that they weren't receiving proper educational support due to language barriers. And there was nothing that the government was doing at that time to accommodate for them. And then the Supreme Court ruled that this violated the Civil Rights Act, establishing language access in education as civil right, not just privilege, okay? So now that comes to the next point where it is the most important part right now, which still affects us today. In 2000, if you can look here on the right side on the white table, Arizona voters passed what we call Proposition 203, which is basically saying public schools have to use English only. So we call it English only law here, or policy. That really eliminated bilingual education, not to mention how it impacted the indigenous communities, right? We're talking about people who are trying to teach their kids Navajo language in the on the reservation land. And then all of a sudden with this English only, it just really cut all the funding and legitimacy for these bilingual programs, or even heritage language programs, right? So that completely eliminated those helpful programs for students and communities, and replaced those bilingual education with SEI, structured English immersion. In that same year, a lot of things happened. As you can see, I'm not going to bore you more with policy stuff, but just to give you an idea of what's happening. And then another development came in 2019. So basically with SEI in Arizona, they said for 4 hours in a day of school day, I don't know if you guys remember how long school time is, right? K to 12. It's not that long. 4 hours is take away majority of the time already. Next thing you know, you get on the bus and go home, right? So it used to be 4 hours where these English learners get pulled out, separated from their class, couldn't continue math, science class, for example, and get put in these intensive English teaching time. missing out, not graduating. And so in 2019, they changed it to 2 hours, which is slightly better, but but I'll tell you why it's problematic here as well. Now it starts with how they choose, right? Who gets to be an EL and who doesn't get to be an EL. It starts with a home language survey, okay? And parents are asked to fill out this form. I personally had to fill out this form myself. Luckily, I sort of knew. But I didn't lie on the form. I wrote down that my daughter speaks Thai, Lao, and English at home. And now that she's not in kindergarten yet, but if she is, she would get tested. It's a mandatory testing. We call it DSLA here, basically to test out English proficiency, okay? And those tests are not very well designed to test any proficiency. I've given it to my pre-service teachers and they couldn't even do it themselves. So that speaks volume of the problem with classification. And one thing I want to point out is that ELs here in Arizona are heavily racialized. We have a lot of white children who just walk around and not being able to get accommodation for their speech therapy, for example, because they're white. People just don't see that they need language help, versus we have Mexican American children who are subjected to this test. And of course they can't pass because it's quite hard and it doesn't even make sense, right? It's not based on real life situations. It's not social language or anything in there. And then they get placed here and they can't get out unless they pass the test, which is very, very hard. And now 77% of these ELs were US born, okay? They grew up speaking Spanish at home, and then they'll learn English in school alongside their peers. Okay, another thing I want to point out is Arizona had approved these models. As you can see, we have SEI, which I just explained as the main thing. And then there's pull-out model, as you all have heard, pull-out ESL model. So students get pulled out from the class, like I explained, or there's 2-hour model, there's a newcomer model. You can see the time split at the bottom. And there used to be access to the language model. 50% target language, Spanish, for example. And then 50% would be English. But now the link got removed. I can't even click on it. And we just got slapped with the bilingual parental waiver request required, and that's very hard to get the waiver. You need to prove that your child is proficient bilingual in English. And like I said, tests can be very problematic. I'm just taking a moment to read the comments. Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, so why study bilingual pre-service teacher of color in my study who were former ELs? Now, I want to say bilingual here doesn't mean they enroll in the bilingual teacher ed. One was, but the other two weren't. Bilingual just means they speak multiple languages, okay? And why it's important to study those who were English learners themselves. And I think it's because there's a lack of literature out there on what happens to these ELs after they graduate high school. Because there's lots of data of how it's harmful to their education up to like high school, right? Maybe a little bit about how it's really hard to get into college, some study out there, but there's nothing specifically about former ELs who are now becoming teachers themselves. So that is why I saw the gap in the literature. And I also wanted to do something a little bit different. There's no survey involved of like 2,000 pre-service teachers. It is about learning the life stories and showcasing all these layered experiences that would help us as educators understand our peers and how the system can change to support bilingual people better. These are my research questions, but I'll just go over the first one because the other two sort of sound similar and do similar things. I basically look at their past experiences and how raciolinguistic identities inform their teacher identities and teaching practices. Raciolinguistic, I'll explain here in the conceptual framework. This is from Flores and Rosa, and I just want to acknowledge that there are previous frameworks that do address race and language, right? For example, intersectionality. This just happened to be quite simple for me to use, and so I chose to use this one to really examine how language is never just about proficiency, it's about power and race. And I also use figured world to understand their teacher identity. And I understand with this framework that teacher training is an ideological space. It's not just a training site for the teachers. And also that highlights the agency of these pre-service teachers, right? I don't want to look at them and be like, oh, they're so oppressed, and not being able to appreciate their efforts and the agency of the little small acts that they do to persist and resist. That leads me to the next part. I love using portraiture. I don't know if any of you have used it. You can also write a portrait of your own, of yourself, or of your own classroom, or of your students, okay? Just wanna highlight this methodology a little bit. So portraiture blends between science and arts together. And with this methodology, I really like it because it really talks about the rich lived experiences of people and really allows the researcher's voice to be part of it explicitly. And it really allows me to weave all the data together and really honor the voices of the people. So Sarah likes to say, we look for goodness in situation and the people, but that doesn't mean it lacks the critical lens either. So it comes with a natural critical lens that I appreciate in this line of work. These are my participants. I know it seems a lot, right? But if you just count to like the middle section, you can see that there are just 10. So I interviewed 10 bilingual pre-service teachers of color who identify so, and then I grouped them together into different groups. So I found out that, oh yes, one of each class from these different professors' class had experienced K-12 in Arizona, were classified as EL. So that's what I focus on in my dissertation, okay? But I just want to acknowledge the other group that I also had, which helped me understand how the people who were never classified as EL, for example, but had similar experience happening in public education, or maybe had it a little bit better set up than those who were ELs, and then compare them to the others. For example, group D really show me maybe, right? I just draw a conclusion here out of 2 people. Maybe being half white really helped you be exempt from being subjected to this kind of test, because they never got asked for a CELA test, for example. Granted, they were studying elsewhere, but Group C also study elsewhere, but classifies EL because they were the only student of color for their cohort. One of a few actually in the entire school. So nobody knew what to do with them. Indy just told me she was just like very dark Mexican American student. She's like, I just grew up with this skin color, and they looked at me and they didn't know what to do, even though I grew up alongside these people. So they put her in the ESL class, even though she didn't need to, obviously. These are my tools for data collection. I interview a lot. I did individual interviews with students and also the professors of each class. I observed the classroom for an entire semester. I also took lots of field notes. I had memos. I collected artifacts. And this is how I analyze data, right? With portraiture, just kind of imagine you being an artist and layering each color to get to where you feel like that sort of represent who the participants are. Now, I use open and thematic coding, quite simple. And then I use narrative analysis as well, and to compare between classes, which became my interest. And that is research question 3. I use constant comparative method. And it's important to talk about the artist, which is myself. as I introduced myself earlier, and Barry did a very good job at introducing me. I'm a trilingual speaker, and I have a daughter who's now keeps saying, I want to speak Thai, like on like everyday basis, right? So we're talking about an angry mother over here. And so, you know, she's biracial, bicultural, and that's just the context of it. And I taught English for a long time, and that kind of helped me understand and appreciate some professor who's more practical in the teaching, but also have that critical lens from my own lived experiences to really question, like, what's going on? Why is the system this way? Let's get started. We're at the findings part. So I want to show the portrait of the first class, okay? So now they have similar core syllabus. They handed down the same syllabus. Now see if you can notice the differences between across these three classes. And I invite you to read these quotes from the professors themselves just to kind of gauge how each class is. I won't be able to read the whole portrait that I wrote so beautifully, but I can tell you a little bit of what I found, okay? So the first class, she's born and raised in Phoenix. She's a person of color, second generation Mexican-American. She was a middle school teacher, and she returned back to school to pursue her PhD because of Proposition 203. If you guys remember from introduction, that's when Arizona started to have English only policy. She was like, nope, not on my watch. Let me go back. Maybe I have a bigger voice then as a PhD graduate. That's what she did. She's like, I want to bridge my role as, you know, a teacher and also activist. And that's what she did. And now she ended up having to teach this course, which goes against everything she believes in. And that was such an interesting battleground, right, between her ideologies and what the state is mandating her to do. I think she did a wonderful job. So majority of her class really spent a lot of time on critical discussions, right? She would talk to the students, and it's a lot of lecture and discussions. She would say, have high expectations for your students, but at the same time, she's forced to teach them about these different levels of proficiency and what to expect. For example, she would say like, oh, for pre-emergent, like just expect them to be able to say or write, 10, 15 words, for example. So that's really limiting. So for pre-service teachers who don't have experience teaching, they may hear that and just have a really hard time. Like, what does this mean to have high expectation while thinking that this is all students can do? But then she also say, put your voices out there, right? She would encourage pre-service teachers to join conferences. She showed like Hispanic educator conference, Black educator conference. She's really showcasing how to build your own community and be a researcher. And I found that very empowering. Okay. I think that's not what every professor would do for their pre-service teachers. And she's taking her time to do that. She also says with SEI, again, she says, when you go for a job interview, you also get to interview them. She's trying to tell pre-service teachers where they should put themselves in, because not every school will be open to accommodating and, helping English learners learn with first language, for example. So just those little things that seem so minor to us, maybe as, experienced educator, but for pre-service teachers, that's a tool of resisting the English only mandate. And that's quite explicit that I felt lacking in other classes. Now, I do have some thoughts as well. And maybe because she only had 3 hours per week, for a whole semester. So she probably had to choose between the nuts and bolts of teaching and then instilling the critical pedagogy and awareness in pre-service teachers. And maybe that's why it falls short on the teaching methodology themselves of how to actually teach English. Now, this is a student in that class. Her name is Valeria. She chose that name herself for my study. I just want you guys to take a look at the quotes she told me real quick. Musa, do you have a quote that stands out to you directly? If you can rate one for me.
I'll go with I feel more Mexican than American.
Thank you. And that's very interesting. She was born here in Arizona, US citizen, moved back home due to her parents' undocumented status. They couldn't find jobs, basically. It was getting quite hard. So they returned home. She came back at 17, US citizen, right? But she always tell me, I'm Mexican. You know, she always tell me, I'm Mexican. Don't call me anything else. So that's just her. She came back at 17 because, not because of choice or just simply wanting better education, but because this is out of necessity. Her family is really struggling in Mexico. So she came back on her own, crossing the border by herself at 17, no family, no parents, and began to take classes at this local school in Phoenix. And she also worked after school, and the center of her value, I sense, is it always comes down to the theme of sacrifice. She always says, my family sacrificed so much for me. Now it's my turn to sacrifice. And for her, she sacrificed everything. Okay, we're talking about her income. She sent money back home. If she had to choose between who gets to eat, it's always her siblings back home in Mexico. And that comes down to really open my eyes about food insecurity on campus, which is leading me to another paper that I'm writing now. Being an ELs wasn't a straightforward path for her. She got asked to read a book. Basically, she got pulled to a principal room and like got thrown a book and just open a random page. And he's just like, can you translate this page for me? You know, to Spanish. Granted, I did use Spanish, but no context, and just first time being at an American school, you know, to her, which is like such a daunting task of doing this. She couldn't do it. So they put her in the ESL class. She ended up passing within 5 months, which is unheard of, okay? She passed compared to all her friends who were stuck there since they were in kindergarten, stuck in that class. And she never gave herself credit for knowing English prior to her arrival here. She always says like, I don't know nothing. And I was just thinking in my head, I'm like, how could you not know anything and pass the test? So we're talking about what labeling does to somebody, right? She was definitely proficient in English. She definitely knew how to pass the test. But because they put a label on her, she just believed that. Luckily, she was able to graduate, pass the test and graduate compared to her friends. It took us 3 interviews, guys, to get to if she was an EL or not, because she didn't think she was an EL. She thought whatever is teaching in the classroom right now, in Professor R's class, it's something different, separate from her. So it took us a while to get to that conclusion that she was indeed an EL. And her identity back then also are shaping her future teacher self. Like she really believes that, you know, you need to know English to survive in the US, and that is very fair. But she's also wrestling with now, like knowing all the critical sides of things from Professor R's class of like what it means to advocate for bilingualism for her students. And then I would like to bring us to the second class, Professor B's class, Baker's class. Sarah, can you pick a quote for me? If you can read one.
The many ELLs are wrongfully classified as special education students because people don't take time to understand their needs. Experience that a lot with my own EL students.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very surprised. That was the first class I sat, and that's what they said. You know, most pre-service teachers don't get to that conclusion quite yet, the first few weeks of class. So that just speaks volume of how much of also an activist Professor Baker is, but her method to teaching is not quite as critical as the first class. Instead of preaching or lecturing about all these critical pedagogy, she demonstrates them. She demonstrates culturally responsive teaching. She goes up to you. She speaks Spanish to you. She does check in. She didn't check in with me, and I was so surprised. I was like usually so used to like just being in a corner of the room taking notes, and she's like, "Are your hands getting tired?" She's like, "I remember my time. Like, you're doing so great." You know, I felt so validated even though I wasn't even her student. So that's just how she is. She teaches with compassion, and she demonstrates it, and that really made some people like Selena and her friends feeling inspired to carry that sense of compassion as well. This is Selena. She's very bubbly. She loves K-pop. She loves anime. Second generation Mexican American. She speaks Spanish at home, grew up speaking Spanish, got placed as an EL very early on from Head Start program. She didn't have any friends. She told me she was so isolated. And she got pulled out just by herself. You know, some ELs got put in a class with other friends. For her, she got pulled out 2 to 4 hours a day, sat there by herself with a teacher. And that really fueled her passion to make a big difference for her students. Now, she's now doing an internship at her old elementary school, and I feel like it's such an interesting point because you know, she returns back as a student teacher versus last time she was there, she was an EL student. So she got there, she told me, oh, this school is so fancy now. You know, she talked to me about the STEAM labs that they have and talking about how her brother got placed in a gifted program. She's like, he's so much smarter than me. And maybe because he grew up speaking English sooner than me, she correlates English to intelligence. And I was just thinking in my head, I was like, but you never got offered the same opportunity, you know? But that's not something she would realize by herself. Is that when she enters school, instead of getting offered to screen for gifted program, she got screened for deficiency. So we're talking about setting up very differently for students now. And she does plan to use Spanish because she got very inspired by Professor Beggars to use Spanish in the classroom. But she's not really trying to teach at a dual language program. It's not something urgent to her. And now it brings us to the last class. And this class is very interesting. Jamie, are you there? Could I invite you to read one quote for me?
I am, yeah.
Thank you. Whichever one you want.
Okay. Not knowing a language isn't a disability.
Thank you. That was a good one. So that was a rare moment of Professor Miller to add on some critical side of like how her ELs would get pulled out by special education teacher because some schools just don't have resources to hire ESL specialists. But that's not an excuse, you know. RJ Olsen, are you there? Could I invite you to read another quote for me?
Yeah. Just I wanted some more context on that last one that said, or not that it says when a student is speaking not so well or low on the scorecard, it's probably because of how they learned back in their country.
Thank you. You chose the best one. That was actually the one I was going to get to. So that's what she said. She's like, oh, you know, if they score very low, it's because of how they learned back in the country. Haha. She mocks ELs a lot in home countries. She's like, be aware of, basically, she doesn't think that these students learn any English at all before they got to the US. And I know for a fact that's not true because English is mandatory in many, many countries, right? Like in Thailand, I learned since kindergarten. Now, it might be different. It's more like grammar based or whatever, but that doesn't mean we came with zero English, okay? And she always say like, oh, watch out for those kids that use YouTube or Duolingo to learn. Haha. And I'm just like, but that helps people learn though, you know? So there's some moments like that where she feels like such an expert in a way that kind of blinds her from alternative ways of learning. And I didn't notice anything about bringing students' home language or funds of knowledge into teaching. Professor Fons, can I invite you to choose one quote for me?
I would be honored. Thank you so
Yay.
much. This is, it feels a little bit like reminds me of some experiences when I was working as an ELL teacher and I had colleagues who were perhaps not as aware or sensitive to the needs of students. And sweetie, this isn't language arts class.
Thank you.
Mm.
Can you guess if that's for K-12 students or higher ed?
K-12.
Nope. She's
No.
talking about university students.
It's
Yeah.
painful.
I know.
It's painful.
It is painful. Yep.
Yeah.
I was there taking note. I was like sweating. I was like, do not say a word, but
No.
yep.
Yeah.
So she said that to me. Luckily she didn't say that in front of, I mean, it just, she said that to somebody, but I didn't hear that in person. But she told me like, oh, I can always tell when the former ELs, because when they come to my class, blah, 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 you know, the way they write is so different, all the grammar errors. She talks about how hard it is to grade these papers because she wants them to pass, but at the same time, they're making so many errors. And so they always have to tell them, she always has to tell them like, oh, you know, you got to learn more by yourself. Like, sweetie, this is not language arts class. Basically, that's what she said. In another way we can look at this is like she's trying to protect her time as a professor, you know, but I mean, there's really no good excuse of this. Thank you. I know. And another one she said was like, this is what she said in class. She's like, oh, I'm thinking 2 languages, help me, and just like mocking ELs right in front of her very diverse classroom. And that created such an English only feel already to it, right? And that's like traumatizing. That's reliving the trauma of former ELs who are now in the teachers' college. And she would say, it's the law. While the first 2 professors always say like, oh, you can use home language, you know, when you're helping them here and like really giving them points how to use their bilingualism ability, basically. But here she's like, it's the law, like don't use English. And that leads to Selena, who was EL early on, but she got tested out around 8th grade. She has a twin sister who never tested out, okay? So her sister graduated high school later, couldn't enroll in a university because universities don't recognize those ELD time as an English credit. So according to her transcript, she never took any English class. Therefore, she's not qualified to be in a university. She wanted to become a teacher just like JP. That was her twin sister. Now with JP, because Professor Miller is like, it's the law, don't use Spanish, you know. And so she went into her student teaching time and 2 ELs from Mexico asked her, like, can you speak Spanish? I'm so sorry. I wish I could redo this whole scene in Spanish. I just don't know Spanish, but she was telling me, she's like thinking in her head, she's like, yes, I can speak Spanish, but she couldn't say that, you know, because she was told it's against the law, until she noticed them really, really struggling. And after 3 weeks, she asked her mentor teacher, who told her, yeah, you can use Spanish as long as it's not the main language of instruction. And that opened her eye. It's something that Professor Miller never touched on, you know. So she had been helping them using Spanish, but as a stepping stone towards English mastery. And that's like the common themes I see now among my participants. Now we're running out of time, so I just want to go over the last few slides. Let's see what you said. Okay, thank you so much. That's what I thought too. Like, we gotta get going so we have time for Q&A. Okay, so I also did a focus group. I made them Thai food. I made them chicken barbecue, you know, with oyster sauce. You never thought you could put oyster sauce on a barbecue, huh? But it was delicious, let me tell you. So we're just sitting down, eating food, talking together. It was the first time many of these people met each other for the first time because they were in different classes. And they just started talking, and we started talking as a fellow immigrant myself and person of color, and touch on a lot about racialized identity of people in different spaces, including labor. Yeah, you can also type questions. Thank you, Musa. I just want to get to answering my research question, okay? And as you can see, Valeria see English as, you know, important to survival. Like, so she doesn't really quite have a problem helping students get there. And that's the common theme among the others as well. With Selena, with JP, English is so important. And JP, even though she tested out early at a young age, she still carried that sense of her, like, I'm never proficient enough. In fact, she said, oh, how ironic is it that now the school is trying to hire her to be a teacher. And she's like, I don't know if I can teach language arts. You know, she was telling me, she's like, because I was a former EL, like this is so crazy. She can't fathom that she is indeed biliterate and bilingual. And then, you know, for Selena, she's now trying to embrace her bilingualism side more. She's trying to read Spanish, but, you know, that sense of teacher, she still want to help students learn English and not Spanish. That's like the common theme. And I believe this is because of their lived experiences. Similar to the first one. And I just want to point out this graph before I end the presentation. As you can see, the most critical pedagogy is Professor R on the left side. And then this is on the spectrum, okay? And if as you move more right, it's the least critical. Remember, Dr. Miller is like, oh, it's against the law and mocking ELs. And then, but if you notice, it's the most practical class. Pre-service teachers love her class. Like her class was so fun, hands-on. They got to practice teaching, you know, so it's just like, it's so far of each side of the spectrum that I wish it was more in the middle somehow. And that's Dr. B's class. But unfortunately, because of the time constraint, she also couldn't completely give them all the tools that she had to teach using culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. And that's just how each class treats within the different levels of policy. I just want to show this. And that's it. Thank you.